In all my social media is an essay that was published at CNN.com by my next guest. The headline is "The GOP's Texas-Sized Mistake on Abortion." The author is former member of Congress Charlie Dent. Charlie represented the Lehigh Valley of the great state of Pennsylvania for a number of years. Now is a CNN analyst, in addition to a whole host of other things that he's currently doing. Charlie, it's great to have you back on the radio program. I enjoyed being with you Friday night briefly on CNN, but there was a lot of subject matter I wanted to get into with you. We just didn't have the time.
Right. No, it was great being with you too. I look forward to this conversation this morning.
So let's begin thusly. Mary Dent Crisp. That's a name I remember because I was just coming of age in 1980 when all of this went down at the time of the Republican National Convention. Tell my audience who she was and what relation to you and what role she played.
Sure. Mary Dent Crisp was the co-chair of the Republican National Committee from 1976 or 7 until 1980. And she was my father's sister. My dad was one of 8 children. My dad was the youngest, number 8, and she was number 7. And she grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, went off to college at Oberlin. Then with her husband, a physician, moved out to Arizona in the 1950s, and Barry Goldwater was her neighbor. And she became very active in Republican politics out there, and became national committee woman, became co-chair of the committee, was secretary of the convention in 72, I believe. So she had a very long, distinguished career in politics, but became very disenchanted when the Republican platform was changing in 1980 to reflect opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment and to opposition to women's reproductive rights.
And she had a major split with the party at the time of the Republican National Convention in 1980, which I guess was the Detroit Convention.
That's correct. That's where she kind of threw down the gauntlet and said that she couldn't stick around if these platform changes were to be adopted. And so she had a public split, and then she left. She still maintained her Republican registration, but then helped John Anderson for president, and actually was his campaign manager in 1980.
It's important to let people know or remind or educate, because I guess some just don't know, that the current incarnation of the Republican Party on this issue, on the abortion issue, this is not the way the party has always been. As you just pointed out, 1980 was a critical year because that's when the language was inserted into the platform for the first time. And similarly, the New York Times has a lengthy story that was published in the print edition yesterday, behind a drive in Texas to halt most abortions. And Charlie, it contains this nugget. Evangelicals dominant in the South were largely moderate on the issue, generally opposing on-demand abortion, but open to a variety of exceptions. So in other words, if you go back and take a look at the position of evangelical leaders, it wasn't too dissimilar from the Republican Party in being welcoming.
Correct. And I think that's really what's happened. This issue has become obviously so polarizing and so contentious that where most Americans are, I've always felt, they feel that abortion should be legal under most circumstances, but they may have reservations on and prefer some restrictions or limitations on things like maybe parental notification with a judicial bypass, or no federal funding, but for rape, incest, life of the mother, like the Hyde Amendment. And there might be some areas where they think there should be some limits. But certainly post-viability abortions, although we get into a great debate about when is viability. The medical community has one definition,
sure,
and some of the anti-abortion forces have a different definition. So, but you're right. I mean, I think most people like to see it legal, but they have some misgivings and some apprehension about under all circumstances.
So you spent, correct me if I'm wrong, 14 years in the Congress. Is it fair to say that you were the last pro-choice Republican member of Congress?
Yeah, Rodney Friedingheisen and I were the last two, although I was the last one to vote against defunding Planned Parenthood. So I was the only one to do that on the way out. So yeah, it's fair to say that. So Rodney Friedingheisen and I were the last two of New Jersey, Rodney of New Jersey. And
when you were first elected to Congress, within just a couple of days of getting there, this issue indirectly comes up in the form of Terri Schiavo. Remind everybody what that was about.
Yeah, Terri Schiavo was a case of a woman, and I think she was originally from the Philadelphia area, if I'm not mistaken. I think Bucks County. She had some kind of terrible issue, and it was a brain hemorrhage or something, and she was in a permanent vegetative state. It was irreversible, and her husband wanted to honor her wish, which was to basically pull the plug, so to speak, remove the feeding tube. Her parents objected. Their names were the Schindlers, and they litigated this thing. And every step of the way, the courts in Florida ruled with the husband over the parents. And then, of course, Congress then, finally realizes that the feeding tube will be pulled, and Tom DeLay at the time wanted Congress to intervene. And so there was essentially what was largely a private bill on the Terri Schiavo matter. And Congress was called into session on a Sunday. I mean, I remember getting the call on a Saturday, come down to Washington on Sunday evening, which was Palm Sunday, by the way. It was, I think, the end of March. And the fun backstory to this is I happened to be at a dinner at a Catholic university in my district when I got the call. And I was sitting with a few priests who were running the college, the university. I said, I have to go to Washington to vote on this, tomorrow to vote on this bill. I said, why would you be voting on a bill on Palm Sunday? And I said, well, it's this Terri Schiavo matter. And he said, well, why would you be doing that? And I said, well, Father, I mean, a lot of the pro-life forces are ginning this up. And I remember the priest just said, oh, that's absurd. He said, Catholic doctrine on end of life is very nuanced. And, this has nothing to do with that. And so I'm sitting here scratching my head saying, now, if these priests think this is a really bad idea, why are these guys doing it? But it was really a pander by some very ardently anti-abortion folks who are trying to burnish their pro-life credentials. And that's why they brought this thing up. I mean, there was no reason. And we go down to Washington and we barely had a quorum, as I recall, because we called in so quickly, and it was a recess week and members were gone. And, and I was only one of 5 Republicans to vote against this thing. I just couldn't understand why we would intervene in a feeding tube case in Florida that was clearly a judicial matter and certainly a state matter. This had no real federal jurisdiction that I could see. And I just thought we had no business intervening. If they had sided with the parents, we shouldn't have intervened, the courts. But they sided with the husband, and that's what this was. And of course, it became a national embarrassment then. A few days later, I mean, people said, what is Congress doing? Well, have they lost their minds? Why? It just offended the sensibilities, I think, of a lot of ordinary Americans.
We've all known that abortion was headed for a judicial determination, a big Supreme Court determination this year because of the Mississippi case, the 15-week case. I candidly didn't see Texas coming down the pike, and yet here we are, 6 weeks as a cutoff, no exception for rape or incest, and also empowering the use of civilian litigators to try and do the work of government in this instance. Talk to me about Texas. Why do you think we're having this conversation? Why did they do what they're doing, and where's this headed?
Well, clearly they're trying. Look, Michael, you're the smart lawyer here. It's a very clever legal strategy, apparently, and maybe for the moment anyway. It seems that they have suspended Roe v. Wade in Texas for the moment. But the problem with this law on a political level is that, as you said, it essentially bans abortion at 6 weeks when many women don't realize they're pregnant at that point. No exceptions, rape and incest, and this $10,000 payment, by individuals, can sue. I mean, this is particularly concerning because it looks like, it's like almost like an informant law, like a snitch law. If you snitch, there's a $10,000 opportunity for you to snitch on a family member or a friend or a doctor or a nurse or somebody who's assisting a woman exercise what I thought was a legal medical procedure.
So the politics of this, you represented the Lehigh Valley. The Lehigh Valley is a swing area. You were perfectly suited to represent that type of territory. How does this play in suburbia in the midterms? I spoke in the first hour of my program today about how I think the Republican Party is poised to pick up the handful of seats that they need to retake the House of Representatives. Might they be snatching defeat from the jaws of victory with this abortion bill?
They could be. Now, that said, look, Republicans, in all likelihood are going to win back the House. But this Texas abortion law makes it much harder for them. If you're a candidate running in one of these suburban districts, the last thing you want to be doing is answering questions on this, particularly if you're a pro-life Republican. Do you really want to answer the question about the $10,000 payments? Do you really want to answer the question if you think there should be no exceptions for rape and incest? I mean, these are tough issues. I mean, you're not hearing many Republicans talk about this Texas law for good reason, because they know it's a political liability. So this will further, this Texas law, I think, further compounds Republican challenges in suburban communities where Republicans have been bleeding badly for a few years. And this makes the challenge harder. I think it's very obvious that it's particularly among college-educated suburban women, again, a demographic where Republicans have been struggling so much. I mean, it's so obvious to me that this is not something that they should be talking about. They'd rather be talking about the Biden administration's failures in Afghanistan, or the $3.5 trillion reconciliation blowout, or whatever spending blowout. I mean, there are a lot of things they'd like to talk about, but not this.
Charlie, I was going to say, if you anticipated my next question, if you were a fly on the wall of the cloakroom of your old establishment, meaning if you could listen into the Republican conversation, are they happy or dissatisfied? And you've just told me that they recognize that this is not good politics, and they probably wish that Texas hadn't done what they've done. And yet you've got other governors now, Kristi Noem comes to mind, other Republican governors who are looking at Abbott and saying, geez, I guess I should be doing that too.
Yeah, Michael, I can't tell you how many times, and I sat in the Republican conference, I would say something like, why are we bringing up a bill? I mean, they used to bring up this 20-week abortion bill, it was a bill to limit abortions. You couldn't do anything after 20 weeks, even though the viability was at 24 weeks. They would do things like this. And I would say, why are we, or defund Planned Parenthood? Why are we bringing up bills that have absolutely no chance of becoming law? They're very contentious. They don't help most of us. I mean, what's the point? These were simply messaging bills. And what would happen is, in the House Republican Conference, they say, okay, in January, the Right to Life March would come, at the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, and they would come down by the thousands, tens of thousands, and they would march and exercise their First Amendment rights, which is fine. But they always had to run legislation that week, just as a message, just to the supporters. And for those of us in the swing districts and the marginal districts, we look at them and say, why are we doing this? I mean, this isn't helping any of us. We'd rather not be talking about issues like this. We'd rather talk about bread and butter issues that most people are more focused on, who aren't fixated on these very contentious social issues. And the leadership tended to agree with me. I'd say then, can you limit the number of these votes? I mean, it just seems like it's happening all the time. And the same thing with these governors you just mentioned. They're pandering. They're looking at eyeing the presidency, and they think this is their path to the nomination. They're not even thinking about how this plays in a general election, which isn't very good.
Well, it might be a path to the nomination, but it wouldn't be a path to getting to the White House ultimately. I want to ask just a final question on a different subject. You referenced the $3.5 trillion so-called human or soft infrastructure. I'm holding up the front page of today's New York Times, above the fold, Democrats' vision for aid from cradle to grave. I talked about it in the first hour of my program today, and probably I'm going to talk about it again when you leave me. Where do you see the fate of a $3.5 trillion package?
Well, I think, Michael, the number is coming down. It is too big. Look, Joe Biden did not campaign on moving the United States towards Scandinavia on social welfare programs. I don't think he did. I mean, Bernie Sanders did, and he lost the Democratic primary. So I think the number is going to come down. I cannot tell you today how much. It's clear that Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, Josh Gottheimer, and others, have severe reservations about the price tag here. And so I think the issue is it's going to come down. The question is how much. I mean, there's a lot in here. I mean, free community college, universal pre-K. By the way, all the advocates never asked for universal pre-K. They asked for quality programs. I mean, I could go down a long list of things that they have in here that they're going to expand Medicare. They're going to expand, they're going to be all kinds of things here. The tax provisions are contentious. So I think some of this stuff is going to get pared down. It remains to be seen by how much and what actually comes out.
Well, Charlie, you've got this standoff among the most progressive elements of the House. You mentioned Josh Gottheimer and the so-called problem solvers. And what it's holding up is the 1.2 trillion on which even Mitch McConnell agreed. I'm sure that Joe Biden would like nothing better than to sign that into law and get rebuilding bridges and roads and broadband. How do you see that skirmish playing itself out?
Well, right now, the Democrats have agreed to bring up the bipartisan infrastructure bill before September 27th. So if I were the Democrats, I'd vote on that infrastructure bill immediately, or they're going to pass it with bipartisan support. By linking it to the $3.5 trillion package, I mean, I think that's endangering or imperiling Republican support in the House. So I think the quicker they separate the two issues, all the better. And if you're Joe Biden right now, why don't you take the win? Take the win. And if the progressives want to take down the infrastructure bill, well, then let them suffer the consequences of their own actions. I mean, that was a thing that I found with the Republicans too, and we were in. We never, John Boehner and Paul Ryan, they never wanted to let the more extreme elements suffer the consequences of their own decisions. If they didn't want to fund the Homeland Security Department or something, I said, well, let it fail then. And then we can know who to blame. But I think that's where the Democrats should be right now. They should put it on the progressives.
Yeah, but Democrats could never, I mean, the House, there would be a 50-seat gain by Republicans if the 1.2 trillion on which everybody agrees were sunk because AOC and the squad won't go along with it unless they get 3.5. I hope I'm explaining it clearly because I'm thinking it clearly, but that would be a death knell for Democrats in the midterms.
Absolutely. It'd be enormously problematic. Here you have a reasonable proposal. I mean, there's a lot to like in that infrastructure bill. You can find things you don't like, but there's an agreement. And the fact that they wouldn't take the victory is stunning to me. And this is the left wing of the Democratic Party, being bitter and sour grapes. I mean, they want so much. I mean, Bernie Sanders is, I think, proposing initially over $5 trillion. I mean, this is never serious. I mean, even the 3.5 trillion is, pretty out of line. So they need to get serious at some point about, just how far they want to go. And by the way, Joe Biden, when he ran for president, he was running really to help stabilize and normalize the functioning of the White House and government, to deal with the COVID crisis. I mean, most of us, a lot of people who supported him, particularly those swing voters, I don't think we're talking about this kind of level of spending. And by the way, and there's Joel Benison, I believe, Barack Obama's pollster, has pointed this out, that these kind of spending numbers are really problematic for these swing voters who put Joe Biden over the top.
I remember those debates. There were many people on the stage in the Democratic nomination process who were talking about these things. Biden wasn't one of them, to your point. Hey, Charlie, thank you for that excellent analysis. It's nice to see you, and I really appreciate you coming back to the program, and I hope I see you soon.
Anytime, Michael. Always great to be with you. Thank you.